Join subject matter experts as they provide thought leadership and insights for source-to-pay digital transformations in this hashtag Make Procurement Awesome with SAP Ariba podcast. Episodes cover various topics and innovations on source-to-pay, improving business outcomes, best practices, and change management, all designed to help you prepare for awesomeness. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's version of hashtag Make Procurement Awesome with SAP Ariba podcast. My name is Amina Anderson, and today we're going to talk about resource planning and organization design. So one of the things that we really emphasize as a part of a company's digital transformation is the importance of change management. And we talk a lot about 12 keys to success. One of those 12 keys that we really emphasize and highlight is resource planning and organizational design, and why that's so important for companies to really think through as they go through their digital transformation, and to make sure that they're properly prepared from an organizational perspective. So with me today, I have Frank Omare, a colleague of mine who has done a wonderful point of view on organizational design in this space. Frank, thank you so much for joining me today.
It's my pleasure, Amina.
All right, great. So I have a few questions for you, Frank, as it relates to org design, to really get your perspective in this conversation. So I'll start it off with the first one. Why do you feel organizational design is so important for companies to consider as a part of their digital transformation?
Yeah, organizational design is fundamental to any transformation program. And we've seen through the 12 keys of success that resource planning features heavily in there. And the reason why we emphasize organizational change is because it's something which organizations tend to underestimate in their transformation programs. So everybody's heavily involved in the technology and the processes. But what we need to do is to enable the operating model to take advantage of the transformational changes. And I'll explain a bit further. The number one concern companies have in terms of setting any strategy is making sure their resources are aligned to deliver the goals and the objectives. And with organizational design, we're able to review the operating model, make sure that it's going to meet the future needs of the organization, both in terms of the roles and responsibilities of the team within the procurement function, but also in terms of how that procurement function interacts with stakeholders, suppliers, and other partners in the ecosystem. It's fundamental because it allows us to think about not just getting the best out of technology, but getting the best out of the organization. And when I talk about the organization, I'm talking about making sure we've got people with the right resources, with the right skills, in the right roles, making sure you've got the appropriate governance to make sure that the investments come to light, and making sure that the organization is structured to drive transparency and collaboration.
Yeah, that's great. And, one important point for people to consider, too, is that it's an evolving thing, right? It changes over time, right? As you go through your implementation journey, your organization is going to get smarter, better, faster. And so you have to constantly really reevaluate and reassess, the resources, who's doing what, shift resources to different functions, hopefully, moving them into more strategic functions and upskilling folks. So it's an evolving process that changes throughout the journey for organizations. So thank you for sharing that. That's great. So we talk a lot about different organizational models, one being a decentralized model, a networked model, and a centralized model. From your experience, what have you seen work well in both the direct and indirect space?
I've seen a variety of operating models in practice in organizations. And the reason why there is a variety is that no organization is the same. And you mentioned it earlier on in terms of organizational structures needing to evolve and adapt. They're almost like organisms which evolve and change and adapt over time. Yeah. And the structure must also follow that logic. And let's just consider the factors that might influence organizational design. So you've got the procurement function itself, with its roles, responsibilities, targets, objectives. You've got to think about the interaction. How is the organization going to interact with its internal clients, with its stakeholders? How is it going to affect and enable processes? And in terms of the spend category, how might they be best managed? And that's before you even start to think about geography and business units. So that's why there are a variety of models out there. And The choice of model will really depend on the needs of the organization and its challenges and its goals. So, for example, organizations may be structured by internal customer, so in business unit, by process. And what I've seen in organizations is procurement functions are structured so that they actually have a kind of business partner relationship. So it's structured by business unit. Organization structures are aligned by process, whether it's sourcing, category management, operational procurement, or even by geography in terms of countries or regions. And let's not forget spend categories, which is obviously the classic model in terms of category managers reporting into a head of procurement or a CPO. And believe it or not, you can have a combination of the above. What I've seen work really well, if you try and think about it as being centralized, decentralized, and networked, is that for centralized models, that really helps organizations to standardize their processes. And typically that lends itself to direct procurement, where that is managed by a central procurement team. So it's not something you would want to devolve to business units or to regions. That's normally done centrally. So you can get standardization in terms of raw materials, components, specification, control, etc. And it also enables you to leverage a spend and put in place global deals if you have a global operation. Decentralized can work for indirect, where you can have a specification for an indirect component, whether it's IT, stationery, mobile phones, that sort of spend, or professional services. That typically can lend itself to just regional or country deals, but where you are trying to implement global deals for those indirect spends, then moving away from a decentralized to a centralized operating model gives you more control and synergies. A networked organization structure can work where you've got some complex categories where you need some flexibility, both in terms of centralized sourcing, but also adapting the specification to local needs, particularly where you've got variations in product design according to country or region. So I've seen all three models work effectively. Again, organizations are different. They are like living organisms. They change, adapt, and evolve.
Okay, very good. This kind of tees up my next question. So we've been talking a lot about the future of procurement, what the organization structure may look like in the future of procurement. And one of the things that you mentioned in a centralized and even networked model are the standardization of processes, right? As we look to the future of procurement, and I just want to share a quote from McKinsey really quickly. This is from McKinsey's A Roadmap to Digitizing Source to Pay. So they state that 60% of source to pay processes have the potential to be fully or largely automated, yielding up to 3.5% of overall spend savings. So as we look to really leverage emerging technologies, whether it's, AI, machine learning, I think that standardization is going to be so key for organizations. So whether it's, a shared service model, some sort of centralized model, just the standardization of processes across an organization are really going to tee organizations up to be able to leverage some of these technologies as they come forward to really automate those processes, right? Because if you have decentralized processes and, different functions doing things different ways, that's going to be a really difficult process to automate. So I think it's important to highlight that fact, again, as organizations are really looking at their structure and how they want to establish their organizations moving on this digital journey. I think that standardization is going to be so key for them moving forward.
Absolutely. Yes, you're quite right. And centralization enables you to achieve economies of scale, as you mentioned before, in terms of standardization. And there are various reports out there, the McKinsey being one of them that you quoted. Yeah. And in our white paper, Future Procurement, which is an excellent paper that talks about leveraging technology such as artificial intelligence and machine learning to standardize processes, digitalize them, and to drive scale and economy in those processes and to achieve the cost savings that you've mentioned before. We shouldn't forget as well about things like compliance management and also simplifying the source to pay process and also getting complete visibility of what's happening in the supply chain and bringing through a number of benefits such as compliance, inventory reduction. So it really is a fundamental transformational tool, this whole concept of operating model redesign that can enable organizations not only to stay current, but also to embrace the next wave of technology which is coming down the track.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, so for those of you listening, we have a call to action for you. I just want to share some readiness questions for you to really consider and think through as you go through this journey as it relates to your organization and how your organization is structured. So number one, does your organization structure align with the short and long-term program goals? Number two, will your current organization structure support the standardization of core processes and automation of key functions? Number three, is your organization structured in a way that supports teamwork and collaboration across the end-to-end business functions? Number four, is there little to no redundancy of strategic and/or operational roles spread across different groups? And number five, have all internal stakeholders evaluated their groups to identify resource gaps or upskilling that may be required? Things for you to really reflect on within your organization as you consider your organizational design going through your digital transformation. So thank you so much for joining us today. And Frank, thank you for being my guest on this episode of #Make Procurement Awesome with SAP Ariba podcast. Thank you so much.
My pleasure.